Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Sabina. I'm the head of EU and trade policy at techUK and found myself an extra job for the lockdown time. So I'm running this series of events within techUK looking at the world post-COVID. This is week 8. It's a weekly webinar where we are looking at the role of tech in various bits and pieces of the economy and the future, and cybersecurity and future of work, the role of emerging technologies, and so many other issues where basically tech plays a role. So if you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first webinar, please come back. It's every week different topic, and all of them are important in their own way. Today we've got the economy, the small topic of the economy. We're looking at the role of tech in kind of rebuilding the economy and in the kind of recovery phase post-COVID. And for the moderation of this webinar, I'll pass on to my colleague Neil, who's our policy manager for the digital economy at techUK. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Sabina. And first of all, just to go over some of the house rules of the conversation. So as guests will have seen that they're all on mute when they've come into the conversation. And there will be a Q&A as part of this panel. And for that, please do type your questions into the chat box, which Sabina will monitor. And please do indicate whether the question's for one particular person or to the group as a whole. And we'll put those to our panelists later on in the session. The way the panel will run is I'll quickly introduce the topic, and then we'll go on to contributions from our 4 speakers before having a quick discussion between the panel and then on to the Q&A. And hopefully that will be a nice sort of useful 1-hour conversation, potentially while some of you are enjoying your lunch at the same time. But just to kind of introduce the topic. So COVID-19, or the spread of COVID-19, is principally a public health crisis. But behind that public health crisis, an economic crisis has emerged, and one that potentially may be longer lasting than the spread of the disease itself. The governments around the world have taken numerous steps to combat the spread of COVID-19, mostly and to a greater or lesser extent by preventing people from meeting, from going to offices. And that denial or restriction of the point of exchange, where we sell and buy products, where we exchange ideas, has had a massive demand and supply shock to the economy. Now, to kind of steal a well-worn Donald Rumsfeld phrase, there are some known knowns, some known unknowns, and some unknown unknowns. What our known knowns are that we expect GDP, particularly around the world, to fall by quite a significant amount. In the UK, it's projected to fall between 6 and 10% by the end of the year. We know that public, private, and consumer debt is likely to rise significantly, and unemployment could go up, possibly staying high for a long period of time. However, there are some known unknowns. How long is the economic downturn going to last for? That we do not know. We've heard V's, U's, and L's all mentioned in terms of the shape of the recovery. What changes will there be to consumer and business habits? And how will that affect the products and services we want to deliver? How long lasting will that be? How extensive will it be? We don't know, and that will affect businesses across the economy. And then what role will technology play in driving the economic recovery, not just as we seek to adapt to the new way of living, but also as we come out the other side? And then there are the unknown unknowns. Now, there's only really one question we can ask about these, which is how do we prepare for these better in the future, and ensure that our economies are resilient and able to adapt when and if future crises like this come along. Now, I have no idea what the answers to these questions are, but thankfully I don't have to, because we've got a esteemed panel of 4 great speakers who probably have a better idea. We have Philip King, who's the Interim Small Business Commissioner, who has a 40-year experience in credit management, retail, investment, and has also headed up some tech companies such as Olvetti and Vodafone. We have Orlando Machado, the Group Chief Data Scientist at Aviva, who is a leader in all thinking around AI, artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, and various other areas. We have Priya Guha, a diplomat by background and previous Consul General in San Francisco, but is now a leader in venture capital and a member of the Innovate UK Council. And also we have David Turner, the Chief Marketing Officer at Sidetrade, an AI company which is at the coalface of the economic crisis, seeing the impact on both not only their own business, but also their clients. So we'll hear from each of those in turn, and I'll go first to Philip for his thoughts on the period and how things might change as we go forward.
Thank you, Neil. So good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I thought I'd start, if that's okay, by just sharing a little bit about what the Small Business Commissioner is and what we do, because we're not as well known as I'd like us to be. I've been in post since the end of January this year, so I'm relatively new to the role, and I've spent most of that time in the last 3 months sitting on webinars like this and sharing the work that we do. We were set up by the Enterprise Act of 2016. We were formed in 2017, a year later, and our primary purpose is to resolve payment disputes between big and small businesses and to tackle unfavourable payment practices. We do that through 3 streams of activity. We give advice, information to small businesses who ask us for help in terms of how they can manage their suppliers and customers and make sure they get paid. Where we can't help, we signpost to organisations that can. The second stream is that we get involved and help them collect cash from customers that aren't paying them. And this morning, we collected £150,000 for a business that had been struggling for a while to get paid. And so far, we've collected about £7.2 million for businesses, small businesses, in that way. And where we can, we intervene and mediate to get agreement between parties so that they can get paid and get issues resolved. Where we see instances of poor practice, then we have the power to report publicly on what we see and to make non-binding recommendations on businesses to improve their practice and to improve the way they treat their suppliers. And all of those services are offered free. We're funded by the taxpayer, so there's no charge to small businesses that come to us for help. And our third stream is the drive to change late payment culture, which we are actively involved in. So at the moment, we're seeing some best and worst behaviours, and we're getting involved in trying to resolve those where we can by congratulating businesses that are doing the right thing and thanking them, and challenging businesses that are behaving less well to their supply chain to its detriment, and working with them to see how we can persuade them to improve their practice. And in March, we brought the prompt payment code into the responsibility of the Small Business Commissioner, and we now administer that as part of our drive to change culture. What have we seen during COVID-19? We've seen that businesses are nervous and uncertain, and that's no great surprise. We've seen some really good behaviour. We've seen businesses that have paid suppliers in advance for work or for materials that haven't yet been provided in order to ensure that they are sustainable into the long term. We've seen the alternative where businesses have written to their entire supply chain and said they're not going to pay them anything until the COVID-19 crisis is over, or that they're going to delay payment substantially in order to support their own cash flow and help them. And we've been driving businesses to move from that transactional position to an emotional one where they recognise the impact they're having on their smallest suppliers. And I think the one thing that I've seen that stood out for me over recent weeks has been that the payment of invoices is an articulation of the relationship that exists between suppliers and buyers. Businesses that treat their suppliers as partners tend to also pay them on time, and we see that articulated in the way they deal. Finally, what's coming? Well, I think if cash flow has also been king, always been king, then I think it's going to be king, emperor, and president as we move forward. It's going to be more important than ever, and the importance of managing it is going to be absolutely key. We're going to see increased failures. We're going to see more businesses fail. Neil's already talked about the increasing unemployment and the length of the recovery and so on, but we're going to see an increased failure rate, and that's going to damage the economy and damage businesses that remain trading. And I think we're going to see a new perspective on risk and how businesses perceive risk, but we'll perhaps come back to that during the Q&A session that follows. So for now, Neil, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Philip. And then maybe I'll go to Orlando next and to hear his reflections on the crisis so far.
There we go. Hi everyone. Thank you for joining. So I think I'll follow suit and just give a quick intro into Aviva. You've probably heard of Aviva. We're an extremely large, very well-established insurance company, founded in 1696. So we can trace our roots back to before the first industrial revolution. And the reason I mention that is that there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence being the fourth industrial revolution. We've been around a very long time, and we've had to change through dramatic shifts in the way that economies work. And I think if there's any trend that's going to continue, it's the need for flexibility and adaptability as we start to come out of a huge global shock that we've all experienced. Quick overview of what we actually do. So you're probably familiar with things like car insurance and home insurance. You probably are customers of ours in some sense. We have a very big pension business. We have a very big healthcare business. We also have a fund management business, so we're investing directly in a large number of companies. And we've also started investing directly in startups and more kind of pure play technology companies. We have a venture capital arm, and we also partner with founders factories, so we help incubate and accelerate startup companies. Part of that has been because we wanted to rediscover our love of technology and actually understand how technology can help fuel our growth. And that's one of the themes that I think has set ourselves up to be relatively resilient in a situation that we all find ourselves in. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what we're going through now as a company, and hopefully that'll be some examples, that'll kind of leave you with some examples of how the economy might emerge from the situation right now. I think the first thing that we ended up thinking about when we all went into lockdown, I generally spend my time thinking about, you know, as Neil says, artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive modeling, some of the cutting edge of research and technology. But going into lockdown meant that we've had to think about our networks and people's monitors and their computers and how we get people sitting on the right kind of chairs. And actually the logistics of technology was a huge concern for us to start with. Within a few weeks, we managed to get more than 30,000 people working from home. And I think what that has shown is that, firstly, if your hand is forced, actually amazing things can happen. We're a very, very big company, and we can be unwieldy as a company. But a crisis forces very quick decision-making and a level of agility and nimbleness that I think we've sort of rediscovered in ourselves. We've also spent a lot of time trying to model out short and long-term impacts of the pandemic on our own business, which has been a huge use of technology actually for us, and a huge use of data. Not always, again, the cutting edge of data science, quite often the use of data to make a fact-based decision, but also combine that with human judgment. And I think that's also a trend that has always been a trend, but I think will be increasingly visible. I think there's been a slight mythologizing about cutting edge of technology as if they operate in a vacuum. And I think it's a combination of technology, data, and human decision-making that I think is really, really powerful. I think for us as well, we've I think fallen back in love with our purpose, because insurance companies can often be seen as big, faceless corporations, the sort of dark side of finance sometimes. But we're remembering that really we're the people that protect the things that people value the most at some of their toughest times. So we can very quickly adapt our products in response to a crisis. We've been able to offer, you know, NHS workers free breakdown cover or improved home insurance cover. Very small things, but make an important difference. If people are breaking down on their way to a key worker role, we wanted to be able to step in and help. I think also, if our customers are in financial hardship, we've been able to offer them help very, very quickly. And so some of these things have helped us understand that really we're trying to play an important role across all of society and help protect people at times when they really need it. I think in the longer term, we're trying to use data and technology to plan out exactly what's going to happen as we emerge out of this current situation into what's likely to be a recession of some kind of unknown depth. I think for me, what that's reminded me of is the fact that actually prediction is extremely difficult. My background is predictive modeling and the use of data to make predictions. And I've ended up thinking that prediction is extremely dangerous. And I think that the best you can do is plan out scenarios that are based on data and accept that those scenarios might have a huge amount of inherent uncertainty in them. But I think the flip side of technology and the flip side of data is that it offers you the opportunity to learn really quickly what is actually happening. And I think that to me is the side of data and technology that's sometimes forgotten. Trying to make predictions or trying to claim you have a crystal ball, I think, is not a great thing to do. Using technology to learn how consumers are adapting, how needs are changing, how experiences can shift, and also how increasingly you can match up supply and demand in very flexible and adaptable ways. That to me is the key of how an economy works. Philip was talking about cash flow being key. Cash flow comes from when supply and demand are matched up properly. Technology has always played a really great role in matching up supply and demand. And if you think about the rise of Google, the rise of Facebook, their core strength and their core capability is matching supply and demand. That might be for advertising, it might be for search terms, but matching those things up at scale is a core role of technology. Think about the way that Uber has taken over with matching up supply and demand for something as previously mundane as a minicab ride. Trying to work out how we scale up that capability of technology across all businesses, not just tech giants, small businesses, local businesses, that to me is one of the key features of how we're going to emerge from this kind of economy. Also adapting to the fact that we might have a move away from blanket lockdowns to very much more tailored, specific interventions. Again, understanding how consumers react to that, how local economies react to that. Again, there's a very big role for technology and data there. So I'm going to leave it there. I've hopefully seeded a couple of themes, but happy to pick up more as the conversation moves on.
Thanks very much, Elijah. That was really interesting as a kind of good oversight of how the role of data and how it interacts, not just with predicting crises, but how we manage it as we go forward. Priya, I might come to you next. I know you've worked with some of the most, not only have it in your past working in San Francisco Bay Area, but also working now with some of the most innovative technology companies in the country. What's your assessment of where we're going and what impact it's going to have on the marketplace?
Thanks so much, Neil. So let's dive straight in. I won't introduce myself across all of my hats, but suffice it to say, in terms of my personal introduction, I'm a venture partner at a VC fund, San Francisco-based fund called Merian Ventures. We invest in female-led deep technology, so areas like AI, cybersecurity, those sort of areas that have been touched on already. I'm also a member of the Innovate UK Council. I advise a number of startups and also adjunct faculty at the Ashridge Hult Business School. I think, in all of those hats, it won't surprise anyone in the audience to hear that my view is very much firmly that tech will play an absolute central role in the post-COVID economic recovery. Why? Well, in my view, tech is incredibly agile. Tech is also very high growth, and it's also a very strong employer, which is going to be one of the keys to coming out of the crisis, both in terms of the professional jobs, but also the knock-on effect of service jobs that tech creates. That was very much a theme in the San Francisco Bay Area. I believe it's also a theme in our strong tech hubs across the UK, London and elsewhere across the UK. And I think, the best example we've seen about how tech has responded to the crisis is actually in the field of healthcare. When the crisis hit, as Orlando has just been touching on in terms of the importance of data, we've seen that the decentralization of the way that NHS England and Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland had been developing meant that it was very, very difficult for us to respond comprehensively to the crisis we were facing. So one of the first reactions to that crisis, rightly, was how do we get the right data systems in play to understand the depth of the problem, get that day-to-day changes of information that allow us to respond effectively. So we've seen, data become central to our response to the crisis. We've also seen technology as a whole become central to the response. Now, we've seen the biggest companies, the Googles come in, Palantir, even companies like Faculty come in with big solutions that can help us centrally. I think the beauty of what we're seeing as well is that small companies can play a role. And I know that both Philip and Orlando have mentioned this already, but actually small tech companies can be very much part of the solution to what we're going through across the board in the economy, but particularly around healthcare. There's some great examples of that. A friend of mine called Melissa Morris runs a fantastic company called Lantum. They basically manage shift working patterns for healthcare professionals. They have, I think, 21,000 clinicians on their books, 2,000 GP surgeries. As soon as the crisis hit, she was able to work with the NHS to give them access to that platform across the UK, even though they themselves are a small business, and respond, but use that resource to respond effectively to the crisis. I advise a company called Chiron Medical. They use artificial intelligence for cancer detection. As everybody probably knows, cancer screening has been completely stalled because of the COVID crisis. Part of our recovery plan post-COVID has to be, how can we use technology, like the technology that they have, to help us address that backlog in breast cancer screening and make sure that people aren't dying unnecessarily because we haven't brought the right technologies into the system. So there's some amazing examples across the board of how technology is helping us respond. But I think, you know, we need to also be realistic, and realistic on two fronts. One, that technology is not immune itself to the crisis. We will see companies being hit, large and small. And in terms of when you're thinking about small companies, that will mean us losing some startups. Some startups would have failed anyway. So, you know, there is a reality that we need to accept, that some startups would have failed anyway. But it has been reassuring to see that government schemes have been put in place to try and sustain the sector, because I think that is a recognition across the board that actually this sector will be crucial for our post-economic growth. The other point, though, that we need to remember is that whilst, you know, I and many people on this call live and breathe the world of technology, it is not the whole of the economy. And I think part of what we all need to think about, and what we have an obligation to be doing as the tech sector, is to think about how can we support the rest of the economy to be using tech to the best advantage to make that economic growth not just a story about technology or the technology sector, but a pan-economy story, which is really important. I think the final thing that I just wanted to flag, Neil, was just something that for me is one of the biggest concerns I have about our post-COVID economic recovery. And that is about the relevance of diversity and inclusion to successful economic growth. Many of you will be, I'm sure, familiar with the work that McKinsey has done over a number of years about the impact of diversity on business performance. And they've actually just released their latest stats, and I'd point anyone to it if they're interested. But essentially, in terms of a gender diverse senior team, it's 25% financial outperformance. In terms of an ethnically diverse senior team, 36% financial outperformance. So there are clear, time and time again, statistics that demonstrate the importance of diversity and inclusion for better economic performance. There's also repeatedly statistics that demonstrate the importance of diversity to better innovation. We can't innovate for a small subsector of society. We have to innovate for the whole of the economy and for the whole of society. But what we're seeing is a lot of the schemes that are put in place, a lot of the reactions to the crisis are actually exacerbating gender inequality, exacerbating the representation for minority across the board in that growth story. We're seeing a disproportionate effect on women in terms of furlough, in terms of pay, in terms of hours spent on work supporting children whilst they're homeschooling, etc. We're also seeing that many of the support schemes for startups might also disproportionately help the status quo founders rather than female founders or unrepresented founders across the board who might not have had access to that funding before. So we have a real risk. And then even things like, I don't know if people are aware, but gender reporting in terms of the gender pay gap reporting the government has announced it suspended it for this year. So what message did that send across the board is that actually we are not recognising that not only is economic recovery across the board relevant, but actually a diverse and inclusive economy will be one of the keys to success. And that is one of the things that I think, you know, we really need to flag and keep shouting about, so we don't lose the importance of that for the growth that we shall hopefully have post-COVID. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks very much, Priya. And that's a really good reflection as well, not only just drawing on your wide experience across the sector, but also how do we make sure we don't lose sense of our strategic objectives around diversity, and even if you expand that into the green recovery while we go through this crisis, because that will be really important. And we'll come back to that just after we've heard from David. But as you, Priya, and both Philip and Orlando mentioned, lots of companies are facing an incredibly tough time at the moment. Running a business right now is extremely difficult. So it'll be really great. It's really great to hear from David, particularly on how he's managing that and what the impact on his clients have been.
Right, yes, thank you. So just to introduce myself, David Turner, I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Sidetrade. I think, so Sidetrade we're a software and AI company. We use AI to help companies unlock value from their customers, in particular around the area of cash collection and credit management, and also driving more revenue from their customers, which, if you think about it, collecting cash and getting more revenue from your customers is going to be something that people are definitely going to focus on in the next few years, I'm sure. The thing we're seeing in this crisis, and I think it's not rocket science, is, you know, we're seeing it drive massive innovation and also acceleration of trends, both good and bad. When I look at how it affected our company, in line with many others, just as Orlando mentioned, you know, the first focus was on getting our own staff to work from home, and making sure that they were safe and able to do their jobs. And then immediately alongside that our customers were able to do the same, and they weren't having any issues, for example, with logging into our systems from outside of their networks and so on, which all went pretty smoothly. But what we realized quite quickly, talking to our customers and to prospects, was that the whole area of cash collection, which is an area we focus on, and Philip mentioned is absolutely critical at the moment, is actually one where, you know, cash collectors typically are probably the last team in the company who ever were set up to work remotely. They would typically sit in an office somewhere near the finance director or the credit management director and be on the phone chasing invoices, and a very kind of manual, very traditional process. So many of our prospects that we talk to, many companies that we talk to, were having just problems, you know, getting laptops for their cash collectors and getting them to work from home. But then also, you know, the process was often very much around sending invoices through the post, or even just phoning people up became very difficult when switchboards weren't manned, post wasn't viable, and emailing, you know, PDFs was a bit random and uncontrolled. So, you know, and our system is exactly meant to help people with that, to digitalize that whole process and also help them automate a lot of the key steps using AI. So we were able to actually innovate very quickly ourselves to create a light version of our product that helped people digitalize that whole process, to control their cash collection process, to pick up and automate some of that using AI, and to implement that in 1 week, which even for us was extremely quickly. We were typically, you know, implementing products in more like 3 or 4 months. But we were able to innovate, and within 2 weeks of the lockdown, offer that for free to customers who were in trouble with collecting payments. And that was definitely, we saw a huge take up in that. You know, that led us to think, well, there's obviously real pain out there in terms of people collecting money. Some of our larger customers, interestingly, stopped their cash collection process or put it on hold to give their smaller suppliers a bit of breathing space, which was great to see. but by no means all of them. But you know, a lot of companies were definitely struggling to collect debt, even using technology such as ours. So we realized that actually what we have, with hundreds and hundreds of large organizations around the world, particularly in Europe, using our system, and it's a pure SaaS system, we have a massive data lake that allows us actually to see the status of late paid invoices across companies and across economies. So we'd always thought about using that data in different ways, but probably hadn't got around to it, I guess. So we launched, again, in a matter of a few weeks, a thing called the Unpaid Invoice Tracker. And that tracks the state of unpaid invoices. It's completely anonymized in terms of companies, but it tracks the state of unpaid invoices across different countries, 6 European countries, where we have most kind of impact and where we felt was statistically significant. And that's been really interesting. It's updated every week. In fact, it was updated overnight last night, and it shows the trends. And not surprisingly, the trend of late payment, of unpaid invoices, is getting worse across all countries, particularly in the UK, where at the moment it's about 29% worse than it was at the beginning of the pandemic, but has been as high as 43%. So it's oscillating a bit. Countries like France actually are seeing a much bigger spike. They're up actually 98% more unpaid invoices than in terms of value than the pandemic. But we can't congratulate ourselves too much, because actually when you compare all the countries, we are actually the worst in terms of what the total percentage of unpaid invoices out there. About 40% of invoices currently are more than 10 days late over their due date at any one time, and getting worse, as I say. So that's been a real innovation, and it's caught the attention of lots of people. I know Philip and the small business team have been looking at that and using some of the data. We're about to unveil the data by industry as well. That's taken a little more work from our data scientists, but is also very revealing. And not surprisingly, some sectors are seeing much worse issues around unpaid invoices than others. But that's been an example of us innovating. And I think, when you look at the wider economy, that acceleration to digitalization and digital transformation has just been striking. And clearly, we're not going to go back. So, I've heard people say that it's accelerated digital transformation by 5 years or more. And I think that's probably true. I think one of my interests, I think, around small businesses is actually, how many small businesses have been very slow to go online or have a web presence and those sort of things. And I hopefully this will accelerate that, because there's certainly no way back from that. But yep, from our point of view, it's driven a huge amount of innovation. And certainly accelerated a lot of processes in our company. And so far, so good.
Thanks very much, everyone. And I think before we go to the Q&A from the audience, I think what we've seen is a real blend of discussions from the practical coal-face business side through to what do we really want the economy to look like at the end of this crisis. And in many businesses across the country, particularly SMEs, those two issues will clash in boardrooms and in discussions about how do we ensure our business survives, but how do we want to meet our grander strategic goals, whether that's around diversity, greening our business outputs, or creating a better environment for workers to work more flexibly and to take care of their mental well-being. So maybe it'd be good to hear from each of the panel about how you think we should best marry that. How do you marry the practical and the kind of long-term strategic objectives and communicate that effectively to business leaders across the sector? Maybe go back to Priya first, and she was raising this issue at the end of her.
Well, I mean, I think the issue for me is slightly different, maybe, Neil, which is that survival is clearly, the first thing on almost every business's mind, even those that have been able to respond effectively to the current crisis and, you know, have something that is in demand at the moment, and they are being able to sort of potentially grow as a result of that. So many businesses, whether in tech or outside of tech, have used things like the Fellow Scheme, the Siebel Scheme, the bounce back loans, all of the other things that are there to keep themselves in business. And that, you know, we cannot get away from the fact that that is the fundamental for long-term economic growth in the UK, having that thriving business sector that we know has always contributed so much. The point that I'm making is maybe slightly different, which is that I think what we're seeing now is a risk that, in the context of something like diversity and inclusion, or indeed green growth that you referred to, people haven't really understood across the board the importance of those for that economic growth narrative. So we have had a long time, I think, a risk of people putting something like diversity and inclusion, or indeed green growth, in the CSR tick box. So it's a nice to have. It makes us look good when we're presenting ourselves to our external audiences. But when the crisis hits, as we've seen that happening now, that's the first thing to go, because it's sort of fluff, it's around the edges. Well, actually, you know, as things like the McKinsey report that I've posted now in the chat demonstrate, you know, this is not fluff. This is about the right type of growth that will help you sustain as a business, will help you keep growing your business, but also keep staying relevant to the market needs, whether that's a domestic UK market need or a global market need. So I think the two are very much linked in my mind, but we can't lose sight that actually there is an economic growth imperative that comes from things like diversity, inclusion and green growth.
Great, thanks very much, Priya. Philip, have you got a view on how we can ensure that the two continue in parallel, that diversity and other kind of key strategic goals are part of our growth story after the crisis?
Well, I think, you know, businesses need to be balanced in what they do. I think Priya's made some really good points around diversity, and I quite like the, you know, they're not fluff quote. I'll take that one away and use that, I think. But for me, it's around, you know, the balance of getting the business heading in the right direction, in the right way, with the right people, using the right technology, and so on. And I think one of the key things for me is making sure that businesses of whatever size communicate better than they have done. And we've seen some really good examples of businesses that have talked to their supply chain and had open, honest conversations. And we've conversely seen some really bad examples where businesses have just thought it's okay to send a blanket email to 3,000 suppliers telling them they're not going to be paid anymore. And I hope that one of the things that will be positive coming out of this crisis is that businesses will communicate better and have more open conversations and recognize the need that they need to coexist. And that includes diversity and inclusion and all those other things, and making sure that the balance across the board is right.
Thanks, Philip. Orlando, earlier on in your contribution, you talked about predictions and modelling and making sure that companies are resilient to future crises and planning those trajectories. Now, a few questions we've had through the chat have talked about this issue of resilience and what that means. Does that mean that we need to be more sensitive when companies issue loans? Do they need to be more careful about who they partner with? Or whether companies need to no longer kind of focus on this sort of in and out mentality that all money in must be then spent on improvement, and that some money must be held up to ensure that they can respond to crises. What's your view on this discussion as it's going forward? As I know, prediction and resilience is a big theme of the conversation around the economic recovery.
I think it might be worth picking up on the diversity and inclusion theme, because I think for me, the way to change the dialogue about, you know, diversity and inclusion being part of the CSR agenda is to have people really believe that diversity and inclusion are a route to resilience and a route to innovation and a route to having just a stronger, longer term business. That to me is, I think, one of the silver linings that will come out of this you know, terrible situation that we're in. If people can understand that having the ability to be flexible, to have diversity, have different perspectives, actually gears a company up really well to deal with situations that it's not expecting. That fundamentally is it. It's nothing more complicated than that. And I think those situations that people aren't expecting could be technical. You know, you hear lots of talk about algorithmic bias or transparency and the way that deep tech is leading to outcomes that people might not expect. But equally, they could be about the way that companies respond to crises. And the fact that having different perspectives in the room discussing these things are one of the best ways to ensure that you're well set up. Because it's the antidote to groupthink. You know, that's really one of the things that we're trying to kind of fight against. I think just to pick up on another strand that I think is related, you know, people have talked about working from home and flexible working. I think again, one of the aspects of this you know, emerging from this situation that I'm hopeful about is that people have had to rethink their norms and their expectations about how people work and how people juggle different responsibilities that they might have in their households. Because I think that again is a way to facilitate a workforce to become more diverse and more inclusive. And I think there's been a lot of resistance to that in the past. You know, people wanting to work different hours, or people wanting to work from different locations, or people wanting to juggle childcare with work. And I think maybe, especially for men, it's been an eye-opener, because I think that there's still a cultural phenomenon of women taking on more childcare. And I think actually understanding the way that all of these things can be balanced in whatever lifestyle somebody wants to choose, I think is a real key to move forward. You know, we've tried to make statements about this in the past as a company. We've had, you know, equal parental leave policies for men and for women for a little while now. And it's not really about trying to say, you know, men shouldn't do this or women shouldn't do this. It's about trying to open up people's eyes to different perspectives and help people understand that there is an opportunity to balance work and home responsibilities, and you can have a very good career and a very good home lifestyle, and there are many ways in which you could do that. So I'd hope that the fact that everybody's having meetings and kids are running in and there's noise outside and all, that they're all sort of, you know, everybody's been immersed in everybody's home life, would have the side benefit that people can understand these perspectives a lot better and incorporate them into a more resilient workforce.
Thanks very much for that. No, David, as someone who's kind of engaged in this process and seen it happen in their company, how have the changes that Orlando's mentioned helped change your work culture, or how your employees are approaching the way they do their jobs?
Yeah, interesting. I was smiling there with Orlando because I have dogs who occasionally appear in my certainly audibly in my conversations. So if that comes up, you'll know why. I think it's had a very positive impact on our working culture, and you know, I think the positives out of this whole crisis have been, you know, that we know that big changes are possible. Big changes that we never thought would happen, you know, actually can happen very quickly. Innovation can happen at speed, and that people's long-held kind of opinions and habits can change, and can change surprisingly fast. And I think from our point of view in our company, you know, we've seen almost the opposite of what people thought. We were quite an office-centric company. We have offices in a number of countries, but we didn't do a lot of home working. For various reasons, and that obviously has changed overnight, and interestingly led to more communication and openness in the company than, you know, the office-based sort of culture where you think, you know, it's actually good for communication to have that, you know, chat around the water cooler or whatever. You know, everything from the exec team who, you know, we now meet every week for an hour. And you know, just discuss what's going on and everything from the strategic to the tactical, but also having, you know, every exec doing a kind of open house with the staff every week, the CEO doing open chats and things. We're communicating more than we ever have before, and also have been much more open, I think, or had more opportunity for everybody to contribute to strategy. And, you know, the ideas have not come, and we know they won't come from you know, from the exec team, they come from all over the company. We've got 250 incredibly bright people, and just like every company, and you know, they've all got valid ideas. So I think that openness and communication, and it's almost had the effect of flattening the kind of the culture and the hierarchy, not that there was much. And it's been fantastic. And, you know, and our CEO, for example, you know, who's generally based in Paris, has said, and used to work very much from the office, has said, you know, he talks to more people every day now across the company than he ever did before. And it has definitely changed our culture for the better and for the long term.
That's really great, and it's a good example of how technology is helping shape this. And well, now that we've kind of explored these things, one of the things that the UK isn't very good at, and we've seen this from various statistics across SMEs and other areas, is digitization and taking up digital technologies to allow these kind of cultural changes. What should be our message as we move out of the crisis, or what should be our recommendations to government and to the market as a whole to encourage the take up of these technologies? I don't know, David, if you've got any ideas on that front.
Yeah, I think, you know, as I think we've always said in the technology industry, we shouldn't be afraid of these technologies. They're not about, you know, they're not about replacing people's jobs. They're about improving them. You know, when we think about our sort of role with AI and automation technology, it's always been about trying to free people up from very mundane tasks, which, you know, tend to overload them actually and don't lead to a great sort of work experience or work-life experience, and freeing them up to use their skills and improve their skills and do more interesting things in their job. And that's what we've always done, and that's what we're sort of doing now. So I think it's that, you know, people are realizing they shouldn't be afraid of technology, and that it's a really positive thing. And
Priya, as we kind of, the focus is very much on technological adoption, what benefits and what other skills and experiences do you think that can bring into different companies as they adopt new forms of technology and communication?
I mean, I think it's huge. The key thing I would say though is that, you know, when we sometimes have conversations about technology, it tends to be sort of, you know, the most complex technologies, say the artificial intelligences or cybersecurity, which, you know, to a small business that's not sort of embedded in the tech ecosystem might be completely overwhelming. Actually, what we're talking about in terms of this sort of digitization is just, you know, adopting ways of working that happen to be technology that will help that business operate more effectively. It can just be something as simple as using, I don't know, Square or Stripe to process payments, or, as you know, we were saying earlier, having a website for the first time. You know, digitization sometimes gets caught up in something that feels incredibly complicated, and I think becomes a barrier for some people to adopt. You know, what's the knock-on benefit? Well, I think, you know, there's an upskilling benefit that comes through that process. It gives, you know, the wide variety of people across the UK, if we can make this very much ingrained in how our economy operates, a range of skills that will be the skills that will help them sustain their own business or have a relevance to another business in the future. You know, the economy is changing very fast. It will continue to change fast, and the UK skill set has not historically kept up with that. So there is a really important upskilling, both for sort of highly technical roles, but also something much more light touch that will help everyone make this transition, not just a very small segment of the economy, which is what we need to avoid.
Philip, I think Priya's mentioned it as well as Orlando, that this kind of bread and butter technology can have massive impacts on SMEs, can expand their horizons. Why haven't you think, in some of the, like, maybe you have more detail on this, but in some of the high level data, it doesn't seem like the UK is caught up with its comparatives? Is the incentive structure wrong? Is our approach to doing business maybe not correctly lined up? How do you think these things could be fixed and improved upon?
I think there's a natural reluctance. I mean, you know, we all know that the reluctance and the resistance to change is quite profound in most of us. Interestingly, I was just looking online while Priya was speaking, because government introduced through its Innovation Funding Service its Business Basics scheme last year, which put sort of £2 million out there, and businesses have been applying for that in order to test ways to encourage SMEs to adopt existing productivity boosting technologies, in the words of the scheme. And that's quite interesting to me, because that's not about looking for new and innovative and clever ways of doing things. It's about getting businesses just to use what's already there. And the scheme and the funding was there to encourage businesses to trial approaches that would encourage the take up. And I'm sure that that Sidetrade will be able to subscribe to this. But most small businesses are running their finances either on an Excel spreadsheet or worse, quite often the back of a fag packet. And actually, if they were to use some of the technology available, they could massively improve their cash flow, they could massively improve their productivity, and they could massively improve the amount of time they're able to spend on what they enjoy doing most and are best at. But they tend not to. And as a result of that, their cash flow tends to suffer. And then we see business failures that actually could have been avoided. So I think part of the challenge is getting businesses just to adopt what's already there. And to use it more meaningfully and more effectively. And I think the challenge for all of us as business organisations and for government is to drive that. And I would hope that the crisis we're currently in will encourage more of that and get people to be more keen to do it. And one of the things we have to do is to promote what's available out there and make sure businesses are more aware of it and more aware of how easily they can adopt it.
Great, thanks, Philip. And then Orlando, just picking up on those points, you initially, I think, used the phrase bread and butter technologies. But how have you seen this in your work? Have those kind of adoptions opened the door to wider experiences? Do they create new pathways to take advantage of maybe more advanced technologies that can lead to businesses being able to access new markets and customers?
I think there are always paths to newer technologies, but for me, it can be a distraction, and I think for me the focus should be on often demystifying technology and actually coming back to the fundamental things that businesses should be doing, which is producing products and services that people want, and then facilitating people buying those products and services. That's really what we're talking about. If we talk about artificial intelligence and predictive modeling, machine learning, that's not necessarily something that a customer wants to hear about. They want to know about a product and a service that they can buy, and they want to know that they can pay for it easily in a way that they choose. And I think technology can play a role in facilitating the process of producing the product or facilitating the transaction. But technology can also play a role in helping businesses understand what customers really want. Because by understanding how people are behaving and understanding how they're responding to products out in the marketplace and understanding competitors, people can get much more insight into the way that the markets that they're operating in are actually working. So for me, it's a couple of things. It's actually getting back to a focus on what the customers really want, what are the products and services that we should be building, and then thinking about technology afterwards to think about how technology can facilitate either the creation or the transaction behind those products.
Thanks very much. I know we're about 5 minutes before we have to close the call. But just to go back to one of the things that Priya raised at the start, one of the things that I think is really interesting about this crisis so far is it has changed the way people make decisions. I think, we've all been, I think, surprised and astounded by the quickness that decisions have been made, even in slow moving areas like public services and the NHS over the course of the last 2 months. And obviously these situations won't arise all the time because we're hopefully not going to be in a perpetual economic and health crisis. But that's kind of been one of the big standouts for me. And if we could just go around the panel here, what's their key takeaway, or the key thing that surprised them or shown them how we might do things differently in the future that's emerged out of the first 2 months of this crisis that we've gone through? And I'll go to Priya first.
I drew the short straw of least time to think, Neil. I think, the unexpected thing to come out of this crisis for me will be the knock-on effects of the fast, reactive digitization, data collection, etc., that we've had to do to respond. So once we have much better data, let's just use the NHS as the example, across the NHS, well, actually, businesses across the UK can use that data to build off new products and services. So I think what we'll see is a very positive knock-on effect from that, rushed need for technological adoption of a whole swathe of potential new interesting products and services that hopefully will be better both for an organisation like the NHS, but also for society as a whole. And that's a really, really powerful potential knock-on.
Thanks. And Philip, what's your if you had one takeaway from the last 2 months, what would it be?
I think it would be the flexibility of people, organisations, businesses, and society generally to flex and to change the way in which they behave and in which they conduct themselves. And we've seen some massive changes over recent days. And I hope that will make us recognise that actually we're not so staid as we thought we were and can do things in different ways as we move forward.
Thanks very much. And David, what's your key takeaway?
Yeah, I think, I said, I think the speed at which we can innovate has been remarkable and shows what's possible. And I think going forward, people will look to technology to help them innovate. I think what they should be looking at, what they will be looking for, is technology that's very focused on a clear outcome and that can be implemented and deliver results very fast. I don't think people will want to enter big multi-year IT projects that they may have done in the past.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. And then Orlando, if you had a takeaway or a lesson that you'd learned from the first 2 months of the crisis, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we went into lockdown, the way that we were working was very much determined by our teams, so that we were all working within our own teams. And I think what has become very visible is something that some of us have known for a very long time, which is that technical teams only really work if they're collaborating with other teams. And the power of that collaboration, which has now become visible to very many more people, purely through the fact that we're working on screens all the time. It's a kind of strange to the side benefit in terms of the meetings that we've had to create to be effective have been very much more visibly collaborative. And I think that although technology, I think, has a lot of tools that can help us, ultimately those things only come to life when they are delivered through collaboration.
Thanks very much, Orlando. And I'll bring we're just about 13:59, so just about on time for a 1 hour panel. But just to say thank you very much to all of our speakers for what's been a really insightful and really interesting reflection on what is the most uncertain business environment I think we've all been in. And I've seen that a few of them have dropped some links to an IFS study, the McKinsey study, and support for small businesses in the chat. So please do check those out, take them away as home reading. But from us at techUK, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you in the next webinar series.